The video had already reached 200,000 views when Silvano Bellini first saw it, the shaky footage showing a 9-year-old boy's complete destruction playing out in brutal clarity. But what happened next would prove that some witnesses don't just watch, they act. A deaf child named Ren Montel stood frozen outside Youngstown's most elegant establishment, tears streaming down his face, while teenagers circled him like predators. The incident unfolded on a Tuesday evening in front of Ristorante Bellanotte, where crystal chandeliers cast golden light through windows. Ren had been skating home when they appeared, 5 teenagers led by Bryce Kepler, the high school's golden quarterback whose family name opened every door in the city. Bryce wore his Letterman jacket like armor, the school emblem gleaming against expensive leather. "Look what we have here," Bryce announced, pulling out his phone with practiced ease. The camera started recording before Ren understood what was happening, documenting his confusion transforming into pure fear. Ren's hands moved instinctively into signs, trying to communicate that he couldn't hear them, that he meant no trouble. His fingers formed desperate shapes in the air, each gesture a complete sentence his tormentors chose to see as entertainment. Bryce immediately began mimicking the movements with exaggerated mockery, his friends erupting into laughter. They formed a tighter circle, trapping Ren against the restaurant's marble exterior, while the camera captured everything. Inside Ristorante Bellanotte, Silvano Bellini sat at his usual corner table, a plate of untouched ossobuco cooling before him. The owner had reserved this spot permanently, understanding that certain men required visibility and exit routes in equal measure. Silvano's tailored charcoal suit cost more than most Youngstown families earned in 6 months, the fabric draping perfectly across shoulders that suggested disciplined strength. At 29, he'd built an empire through calculated decisions and an iron code that made him both feared and grudgingly respected. He lifted his wine glass when movement outside caught his peripheral vision, something in the body language triggering instincts honed through years of reading danger. Through the window, he watched teenagers surrounding a small figure, their postures radiating cruel excitement. The boy tried to push through, but Bryce shoved him back against the wall, the impact hard enough that Ren's skateboard clattered to the sidewalk. His backpack spilled open, scattering notebooks and a worn copy of a graphic novel across the pavement. "Dance for us," one teenager jeered, though Ren couldn't hear the words, only see their twisted faces and feel the vibrations of their stomping feet. Tears began streaming down his cheeks, and that's when Bryce zoomed the camera in closer, capturing his complete humiliation. Ren's hands moved again in frantic signs, pleading now, but Bryce grabbed his wrists and held them still with casual violence. The other boys laughed harder, their phones now out too, creating multiple angles of a child's breakdown. Silvano's wine glass hit the table harder than intended, the sharp sound causing nearby diners to glance his direction before quickly looking away. He recognized that particular brand of cruelty, the kind that came from those who'd never known vulnerability. The restaurant's security camera mounted above the entrance captured everything from a different angle, its red recording light steady and impassive. Inside, wealthy patrons continued their meals, occasionally glancing toward the window but not intervening. Ren collapsed against the wall and slid down to sitting, covering his face with both hands as his small body shook with sobs. The teenagers stepped back slightly, admiring their work, Bryce narrating for his recording about finding a freak outside the fancy restaurant. A well-dressed couple exited Ristorante Bellanotte, stepping around the scene with barely a pause, their conversation about wine pairings continuing without interruption. Another group entering the restaurant actually smiled at Bryce. Recognizing the quarterback from Friday night games, Silvano stood slowly, his napkin dropping to the table as his eyes remained fixed on the window. Something in the boy's defeated posture struck a chord buried deep, awakening memories he'd spent years learning to control through willpower and distance. Silvano moved toward the restaurant's entrance with deliberate steps, his presence causing the hostess to straighten reflexively behind her podium. Other diners tracked his movement with cautious awareness, recognizing power, even when they couldn't name its source. The heavy oak door opened smoothly under his hand, releasing him into the cooling October air, where streetlights cast amber pools along Federal Street. The teenagers didn't notice him immediately, too absorbed in their entertainment to register the shift in atmosphere. Bryce was reviewing his footage when Silvano's shadow fell across the group, long and dark in the artificial light. The quarterback looked up, his confident smirk faltering slightly when he met eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "Gentlemen," Silvano said quietly, the single word carrying weight that made the teenagers instinctively step back. His voice possessed the kind of calm that suggested violence wouldn't be necessary because compliance was simply expected. Ren remained huddled against the wall, unaware of the new presence, his face still buried in his hands. His skateboard lay 3 feet away, one wheel still spinning slowly from when it had fallen, catching the light with each rotation. "We're just having fun," Bryce attempted, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. He pocketed his phone with movements that tried for casual but landed closer to nervous, his friends exchanging glances that calculated odds and exits. Silvano didn't acknowledge the comment, instead crouching down to Ren's eye level with fluid grace that suggested comfort in positions most men would find vulnerable. He waited, patient and still, until the boy's instincts told him someone new had arrived. When Ren finally lowered his hands, his tear-streaked face showed confusion at finding a stranger in an expensive suit, sitting on the dirty sidewalk beside him. Silvano's expression held no pity, only recognition of one human being witnessing another's pain without flinching from it. The mafioso's hands moved into signs with surprising fluency, his fingers forming shapes that asked a simple question. "Are you hurt?" Ren's eyes widened, shock replacing fear as he realized this elegant stranger spoke his language. Behind them, Bryce shifted his weight, clearly uncertain whether to leave or stay, his bravado evaporating under Silvano's continued silence. The other teenagers had already begun backing away, survival instincts overriding loyalty to their leader. Ren signed back slowly, explaining that he wasn't physically injured, just humiliated, his small hands shaking slightly as they formed each word. Silvano nodded once, then stood with the smooth control of someone whose body was a perfectly maintained instrument. "What's your name?" Silvano asked Bryce, his tone conversational, despite the tension crackling through the air like static electricity before a storm. The quarterback hesitated, realizing too late that some questions were traps, regardless of how they were answered. "Bryce Kepler," he admitted, and Silvano smiled, the expression that contained no humor whatsoever. The teenager flinched despite himself, his athlete's body recognizing a predator, even when his privileged mind couldn't quite process the hierarchy shift. "I'll remember that," Silvano said simply, then turned his attention back to Ren, dismissing the teenagers as if they'd already ceased to exist. He retrieved the skateboard and backpack, collecting scattered belongings with meticulous care that suggested these items mattered because they belonged to someone who mattered. Bryce and his friends fled without another word, their footsteps echoing down Federal Street in a stumbling run that abandoned all pretense of teenage invincibility. One of them dropped his phone in the rush, but nobody stopped to retrieve it. Silvano helped Ren stand, his grip firm but gentle on the boy's shoulder, grounding him after the chaos. The child's breathing gradually slowed, his body responding to the calm certainty radiating from this unexpected protector. Through the restaurant window, diners had begun to notice the scene, conversations dying as they registered Silvano Bellini personally involving himself in street-level drama. The owner appeared at the entrance, his face pale with concern, but Silvano waved him back inside with a subtle gesture that required no explanation. Across town, in a cramped apartment above a closed hardware store, Alina Montel's phone vibrated against the chipped Formica counter. She'd just gotten home from her evening shift at the diner, her feet aching in worn sneakers that needed replacing 2 months ago. Her 4-year-old daughter sat cross-legged before the television, absorbed in a cartoon whose dialogue Alina had memorized through sheer repetition. The child's innocent laughter filled spaces between the radiator's clank and the upstairs neighbor's perpetual television murmur. Alina grabbed her phone, expecting a shift change notification from her second job, but the screen showed her social media instead. Someone had tagged her in a video that already had thousands of views and climbing, the thumbnail showing a figure that looked sickeningly familiar. Her breath caught as she pressed play, the shaky footage immediately confirming her worst fear. Ren, her beautiful, sensitive boy, being tormented by teenagers she recognized from the high school near their apartment. The sound was on, capturing their laughter and cruel commentary, though her son couldn't hear any of it. Alina's hand flew to her mouth as she watched Ren's desperate signing, his small hands forming words these monsters would never understand. She'd worked 3 jobs for 4 years to give her children stability after their father disappeared, but she couldn't protect Ren from a world that saw difference as weakness. The video ended with Ren collapsed against a wall, and Alina had to replay it twice before she noticed the restaurant behind him. Ristorante Bella Notte, a place so far above her economic reality that she'd never even walked past it, much less imagined her son being destroyed outside its elegant facade. Her phone buzzed again, A text from an unknown number containing a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "Your freak son made quite a show tonight. Better keep him inside where he belongs." Another message followed seconds later from a different number, this one more explicit in its threats about what happened to kids who embarrass normal people. Alina's hands shook as she blocked both numbers, knowing more would come, that the video's virality had painted a target on her family. She moved to Ren's small bedroom, finding it empty, his bed still made from this morning when she'd kissed him goodbye before her first shift. Panic spiked through her chest. The video looked recent, perhaps only an hour old, but where was he now? Her daughter appeared in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, her small face scrunched with concern that children learn too early in households where stress is the constant baseline. "Mama, why are you scared?" Alina forced a smile that probably convinced neither of them, then called Ren's phone knowing he couldn't hear it ring but hoping he'd feel the vibration. It went straight to voicemail, his careful recorded message explaining in careful words that he was deaf and to please text instead. The apartment felt suddenly too small, walls closing in with the weight of every decision that had led here, staying in Youngstown despite its decay, working multiple jobs that left her children functionally alone too often, believing somehow she could shield them from cruelty through pure determination alone. Another notification lit her screen. Someone had shared the video to a local parent group with commentary about problem children and failing schools. The comments section was already filling with opinions from people who'd never met Ren, but felt qualified to judge his existence based on 30 seconds of his worst moment. Alina grabbed her jacket, moving toward the door with purpose born from desperation, already mentally calculating which route Ren might have taken home. Her daughter protested being left with the neighbor, but there was no choice. One child needed finding, which meant the other required temporary abandonment. The street outside was darker than usual, 2 streetlights broken for weeks while the city claimed budget constraints prevented repairs. Alina moved quickly past storefronts covered in security gates, past the check-cashing place that charged criminal interest, past the corner where teenagers sold substances that killed slowly while politicians pretended not to notice. Federal Street lay 6 blocks east, a journey that crossed invisible borders between Youngstown's forgotten neighborhoods and its preserved historic district. Alina rarely ventured that direction, where her worn clothes and exhausted face marked her as someone who didn't belong among the restored architecture and imported boutiques. Her phone vibrated constantly with incoming notifications, the video spreading like disease through every social network, each share adding another layer of strangers who felt entitled to comment on her son's pain. She ignored them all, focused solely on the physical task of finding Ren before something worse than humiliation found him first. Silvano had taken Ren home personally, driving his black Mercedes through streets that grew progressively more worn as they left the historic district behind. The boy sat in the passenger seat clutching his skateboard, occasionally glancing at this stranger who'd appeared like an avenging angel in expensive Italian leather. They'd communicated through quick signs at stoplights, Silvano learning that Ren lived with his mother and little sister in an apartment above Morrison's Hardware. The building came into view, a 3-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch that spoke of landlords who collected rent but avoided maintenance. Silvano had watched Ren disappear through the entrance before pulling away, but his involvement didn't end with safe delivery. He made a single phone call to a man named Greco, who specialized in acquiring information that wasn't meant to be found. By midnight, a file folder sat on Silvano's desk in his private office above a legitimate import business that fronted less legitimate operations. The dossier contained everything about the Montel family: tax returns, employment records, medical bills that told stories of struggle most people couldn't imagine surviving. Alina Montel, 26 years old, worked as a waitress at Rosie's Diner from 6 to 2, then cleaned offices downtown until 7, finishing her day with weekend shifts at a grocery store. Her income barely cleared poverty level despite working 70 hours weekly. Every dollar stretched impossibly thin across rent, food, and Ren's specialized education needs. The father had vanished 4 years ago, leaving no forwarding address and no child support, his last known location being a construction site in Pennsylvania. Court documents showed Alina had tried pursuing legal action, but abandoned it when lawyer fees exceeded her monthly income. Medical records revealed Ren's deafness resulted from meningitis at age 2, the infection causing permanent damage before overwhelmed emergency room staff diagnosed it correctly. Bills from that hospitalization still appeared in collection notices, The debt growing with interest Alina couldn't afford to pay down. The file also contained school records showing Ren's academic performance, straight A's despite systemic barriers that would have crushed students with less determination. His teacher's notes revealed a child who arrived early, stayed late, and worked twice as hard as hearing peers to achieve the same recognition. His resilience documented in progress reports that used words like remarkable and inspiring, while the system still failed to provide adequate support. Silvano discovered that Alina had filed 17 formal complaints with the school district over 3 years, each one meticulously documenting failures in Ren's accommodations, broken FM systems, untrained interpreters, teachers who refused to face him while speaking. Every complaint had been acknowledged and ignored, buried under bureaucratic procedures designed to exhaust parents who lacked resources to pursue legal action. Silvano's finger traced a line in the report, detailing how Alina had taught herself sign language through library books and free online videos, spending nights after her children slept, learning to communicate with her son. She'd fought the school district for appropriate accommodations, attending meetings during lunch breaks from jobs she couldn't afford to lose. A photograph paper-clipped to the file showed Alina from her work ID badge, dark circles under eyes that still held defiance, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the hint of a smile that suggested she hadn't let circumstances crush her spirit entirely. Silvano studied that image longer than professionally necessary, seeing strength in exhaustion most people would read only as defeat. The second section detailed Bryce Kepler's family, old money from steel industry investments made 3 generations ago, the kind of wealth that insulated against consequences. His father Gerald sat on the school board. His mother chaired the hospital foundation, their influence spreading through Youngstown like roots from a poisonous tree. Police reports showed 3 previous incidents involving Bryce: vandalism at 13, assault at 15, drunk driving at 16, each charge mysteriously disappearing before reaching trial. The Kepler family attorney had connections that made evidence evaporate, and witnesses reconsider their testimony under pressure disguised as persuasion. Silvano leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered angles and leverage points. His organization had operated for years on the principle that real power came not from violence, but from knowing exactly which pressure points would make an opponent crumble without throwing a single punch. The phone on his desk rang precisely at 1 a.m., Greco calling with verbal details too sensitive to include in written reports. Silvano listened as his investigator described the threatening messages flooding Alina's phone, the social media comments calling for Ren to be expelled or institutionalized, the parents organizing to demand the disruptive deaf kid be removed from their children's school. When the call ended, Silvano sat in darkness, broken only by his desk lamp's amber glow, thinking about a 9-year-old boy who'd done nothing except exist while different. The Kepler family probably assumed their wealth made them untouchable, that Youngstown was small enough they could control any narrative that threatened their golden son. They were about to learn that some men built empires specifically because they understood power better than those born into it. Silvano had spent 20 years studying how to dismantle lives without ever breaking laws or making threats that could be recorded or repeated in court. His next call went to a woman named Patricia, who owned Youngstown's most read local news blog, her investigative journalism having exposed corruption that traditional media outlets ignored. She answered on the second ring despite the hour, recognizing his number, understanding that when Silvano Bellini called, the story would be worth losing sleep over. Alina had found Ren sitting on the apartment building's back steps, his skateboard across his lap, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of someone whose safe world had shattered. She'd held him for 20 minutes while he cried against her shoulder, his body shaking with sobs that made no sound. Thursday morning arrived too quickly, dragging Alina from 3 hours of anxious sleep toward another shift at Rosie's diner. She'd called in sick to her cleaning job, unwilling to leave Ren alone despite desperately needing the income, her already tight budget now bleeding from a decision between presence and survival. The knock came at 9 a.m., unexpected and authoritative enough that Alina checked through the peephole before opening. A man stood in the hallway wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, his presence so incongruous with the building's shabby corridor that she initially thought he had the wrong address. Ms. Montel? His voice carried the kind of cultured polish that came from private schools and deliberate elocution lessons. My name is Silvano Bellini. I witnessed the incident involving your son Tuesday evening. Alina opened the door only wide enough to establish a barrier between her home and this stranger, her body language screaming caution despite his expensive appearance. She'd learned years ago that predators came in all packages, sometimes especially the polished ones who smiled while destroying you. I brought your son home that night, Silvano continued, making no move to enter uninvited. I'd like to discuss what happened if you'll permit me a few moments of your time. Something in his directness cut through Alina's defensive instincts. He wasn't selling anything, wasn't promising salvation, just stating facts and requesting permission like her time actually mattered. She stepped back, gesturing him inside while mentally cataloging exits and weapons within reach, should this turn dangerous. The apartment revealed itself in harsh morning light, furniture bought second-hand, and maintained with more determination than success, walls that needed painting, carpet worn thin in traffic paths. Alina watched Silvano's eyes take inventory without judgment appearing on his face, a small mercy that made her hate him slightly less. Ren emerged from his bedroom, freezing when he recognized the man from Tuesday night, surprise and confusion warring across his expressive features. Silvano's hands moved into signs immediately, asking permission to sit and talk, treating the 9-year-old like an equal participant in whatever conversation was about to unfold. I know who you are, Alina said quietly, once they'd settled around her kitchen table, scarred by years of use. Silvano Bellini doesn't drive through my neighborhood without people noticing. The question is what you want with my family. Silvano smiled, genuine amusement flickering across features usually reserved for intimidation and calculation. She'd done her homework during the sleepless hours after midnight, asking questions through carefully maintained connections to Youngstown's underground economy that functioned parallel to legitimate society. I want nothing from you, he replied, sliding a manila folder across the table. I'm here to offer information and resources, should you choose to use them. Alina opened the folder to find a complete dossier on Bryce Kepler, his previous offenses, his family's interference in investigations, documentation of wealth used as a weapon against accountability. The thoroughness shocked her, each page revealing research that must have cost thousands of dollars and favors she couldn't begin to calculate. Why? The word came out harder than intended, sharpened by years of learning that nothing came free, especially from men with power who appeared in your kitchen bearing gifts. What possible reason could you have for helping us? Silvano glanced at Ren, who watched their conversation with the intense focus deaf children develop to compensate for missing auditory information. When the mafioso's eyes returned to Alina, they held something uncomfortably close to vulnerability beneath their usual calculation. When I was 12, I watched my younger sister get tormented by neighborhood boys who thought her learning disability made her fair game, he said, his voice dropping to near whisper. I was too small then to stop it, too powerless to do anything except remember how rage and helplessness taste when you swallow them together. The admission hung between them like a bridge built from uncomfortable truth, connecting their disparate worlds through the universal language of failed protection. Alina felt her defensive walls crack slightly, recognizing that rare commodity, someone who understood without needing explanation. Ren's small hand touched Silvano's arm, drawing the mafioso's attention to fingers forming careful signs. The boy asked why a stranger would care about his problems when so many others had witnessed his humiliation and simply walked past without intervention. Silvano's response came in fluid sign language that spoke of hours. Learning this visual grammar most people never bothered to acquire. He explained that power meant nothing if not used to protect those society deemed unimportant, that strength measured itself not in dominance, but in defense of the vulnerable. Alina watched this exchange with growing disbelief, seeing her son's posture gradually relax, as he recognized someone who didn't view his deafness as deficiency requiring pity. Ren signed questions about Silvano's sister, whether she was okay now, if the bullies ever faced consequences for their cruelty. My sister died when she was 15, Silvano answered, his hands forming the words with particular gentleness, not from the bullying directly, but from believing what they told her about her worth. The kitchen fell into weighted silence, broken only by the radiator's rhythmic clank and distant traffic humming through walls too thin to block sound. Alina felt tears threatening, understanding now why this powerful man sat at her scarred table offering help to strangers who could never repay the debt. I failed her, Silvano continued, his eyes finding Alina's with intensity that demanded she hear the truth beneath his words. I was 17 when she died, just beginning to build the power I have now, and I made myself a promise in the hospital chapel while her body cooled. Ren leaned forward, completely absorbed in this story that paralleled his own experience with precision that felt almost painful. Silvano's hands moved again, explaining how he'd vowed to use whatever influence he built to ensure other vulnerable children didn't suffer alone and undefended. "I'm not a good man, Ms. Montel," Silvano said, switching back to spoken words while maintaining eye contact that refused to let her look away. "My business involves activities you'd find morally questionable at best, criminal at worst, but I maintain lines I won't cross, and debts I insist on paying." Alina processed this confession that was simultaneously warning and reassurance, understanding he was offering transparency most men in his position would never provide. She studied his face, finding sincerity in the tight set of his jaw and the way his fingers drummed once against the table, like a nervous tell he couldn't quite suppress. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her practical nature overriding emotional response. "Because I can't afford lawyers or private investigators, and I won't let my son become some crime lord's charity case that creates obligations I can't fulfill." Her daughter's laughter filtered through the thin walls from the neighbor's apartment where she'd been left watching cartoons, the sound a reminder that Alina's decisions affected more than just herself. Every choice carried weight that multiplied across two children's futures, and accepting help from Silvano Bellini meant entering a world where debts weren't always paid in currency she understood or could control. Silvano seemed to read her hesitation with the accuracy of someone accustomed to calculating human nature's variables and probabilities. He leaned back slightly, creating physical space that paradoxically made the conversation feel less pressured, his body language communicating patience most men in his position wouldn't bother demonstrating to someone without power or leverage. Silvano's smile returned, appreciating her bluntness in a world where most people spoke to him in careful euphemisms designed to avoid offense. He explained his plan with the precision of someone who'd spent days thinking through every angle and consequence, presenting options rather than demands. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed, its mechanical rhythm marking seconds while Alina processed information that could either save or destroy her family depending on factors beyond her control. She noticed details she'd missed initially, the way Silvano's hands rested flat on the table without fidgeting, the steadiness of his breathing that suggested comfort with difficult conversations, the absence of jewelry or ostentation despite wealth evident in every thread of his clothing. Ren shifted in his chair, drawing both adults' attention to signs, asking if this meant the teenagers would be punished for what they'd done. His small face held hope tempered by experience, the expression of someone who'd learned too young that justice often depended on factors having nothing to do with right or wrong. The Kepler family's influence came from money and social position, but Silvano had accumulated a different kind of capital: information, connections, the ability to apply pressure through legitimate channels that couldn't be dismissed as mob intimidation. He could ensure Bryce faced real consequences without violence, using the law itself as weapon against those who'd always considered themselves above it. "I'm offering to level the playing field," Silvano clarified, his hands flat on the table like he was physically grounding his promises in something tangible. "What happens after that is your choice. Pursue charges, demand school policy changes, or simply ensure your son never faces that particular tormentor again." Ren's hand found his mother's, small fingers gripping tight, as he watched her face calculate risks against potential rewards. Alina had spent years making impossible decisions between bad options and worse ones, but this felt different. Someone offering help without immediate cost, making her distrusted even as she desperately wanted to believe. "Why should I trust you?" The question came out quietly but firm, her exhausted eyes meeting Silvano's with challenge that demanded honest response. "You could destroy them today and forget about us tomorrow, leaving my family to deal with whatever revenge they craft once you've moved on to other concerns." Silvano stood, moving to where Ren sat, and crouching to his level with that same fluid grace he'd demonstrated Tuesday night on a dirty sidewalk. His hands formed signs again, asking the boy a direct question about whether he felt safe, whether he could return to school without fear, whether the video replaying across social media allowed him to sleep at night. Ren's response came in hesitant gestures, admitting he was terrified, that kids at school had already started treating him differently, that he'd heard his mother crying through the walls at night. When his hands finally stilled, Silvano reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, placing it on the table before Alina with almost ceremonial care. The meeting took place Friday afternoon in the principal's conference room at Youngstown Central High, a space designed to intimidate parents with its polished mahogany table and diplomas covering walls like territorial markers. Gerald Kepler arrived first, his attorney trailing behind carrying a briefcase that probably held threats disguised as legal documents. Principal Dawson sat at the head of the table, his face already showing the strain of a man caught between influential families and actual justice. The school board had called him 3 times that morning, each conversation subtly suggesting that certain donors' feelings mattered more than policy enforcement. Bryce slumped in a chair beside his father, still wearing his Letterman jacket like armor that was rapidly losing its protective power. He'd spent 2 days watching his video get dissected across social media, the comment section turning from supportive to condemning as context spread beyond his initial followers. When Silvano entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop despite October sunshine streaming through windows. He wore navy this time. The suit fitted perfectly across shoulders that suggested he'd be equally comfortable in a boardroom or breaking someone's composure with nothing but presence. Alina followed 3 steps behind, her best dress slightly outdated but clean, her posture radiating the particular dignity of people who'd survived circumstances that should have destroyed them. Ren walked between them, small and silent but no longer cowering, his hand occasionally brushing Silvano's sleeve like an anchor in uncertain waters. "Mr. Kepler," Silvano said, his voice pleasant as poisoned honey, while he claimed the seat directly across from Gerald. "Thank you for accepting this meeting. I believe we have matters requiring immediate discussion." Gerald's attorney opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, withdrawing documents meant to establish legal authority and implied consequences. But Silvano simply placed his own phone on the table, the screen showing a paused video from an angle none of them had seen before. Ristorante Bellinotte's security footage capturing everything in crystal clarity. "This footage has already been provided to local media," Silvano explained calmly, watching color drain from Gerald's face. "Along with documentation of 3 previous incidents involving your son that mysteriously disappeared from official records." Principal Dawson's eyes widened, understanding suddenly shifting about who held actual power in this room. The school board might have influence, but they couldn't control stories once legitimate journalists started investigating, especially when provided with evidence too substantial to ignore. Bryce finally looked up, meeting Ren's eyes for the first time since Tuesday night, and something in the deaf child's steady gaze made the quarterback flinch. There was no anger there, only exhausted sadness that asked why cruelty had seemed entertaining enough to record and share. "My client is prepared to make a statement," Gerald's attorney attempted, but Silvano raised one hand in a gesture that commanded silence without aggression. The lawyer stopped mid-sentence, recognizing authority that transcended legal credentials or family money. "I'm not interested in statements," Silvano said, his attention focused entirely on Bryce now. "I want to understand what you hope to accomplish by tormenting a 9-year-old child who'd done nothing except exist in your vicinity." The question hung in air thick with tension, demanding answer that couldn't hide behind excuses or justifications. Bryce opened his mouth twice before words actually emerged, his usual confidence completely absent when faced with someone who refused to be impressed by touchdown records or family connections. "I don't know," he finally admitted, voice barely above whisper. "It seemed funny at the time. Everyone was laughing and he couldn't hear us anyway, so I thought it didn't really matter." Alina's sharp intake of breath cut through the room like a blade, but Silvano's hand on her arm conveyed a message. Let the boy finish digging his own grave with honesty. Ren watched Bryce's face, reading emotions there that most people missed when they relied solely on words and tone. "You thought it didn't matter," Silvano repeated slowly, each word precisely enunciated. "Because he experiences the world differently than you, his humiliation somehow weighed less, required less consideration, deserved less basic human dignity." Principal Dawson made notes with a pen that shook slightly, understanding this meeting would define his career one direction or another. He'd spent years avoiding confrontation with powerful families, but the evidence Silvano presented made neutrality impossible without becoming complicit. Gerald leaned forward, attempting to regain control through bluster and veiled threats about donations and board positions. But Silvano's expression didn't change, merely patient and expectant, like a professor waiting for a slow student to realize they'd already failed the test. "Your son committed assault on camera," Silvano stated, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious to the deliberately obtuse. Not just morally, but legally. The physical contact, the restraint, the deliberate infliction of emotional distress. Ms. Montel has grounds for charges that your attorney's previous magic tricks won't make disappear. The lawyer started to argue about evidence standards and prosecution likelihood, but Silvano withdrew a second phone showing text messages. The threats sent to Alina's number from accounts traced back to students whose parents all happened to be Kepler family friends. Conspiracy to harass built itself into prosecutable pattern right there on the screen. However, Silvano continued, and the single word shifted everything again. Ms. Montel and I discussed alternatives to criminal charges, provided certain conditions are met with absolute faithfulness. He outlined terms with the precision of someone accustomed to negotiating high-stakes agreements, where deviation meant consequences worse than legal prosecution. Bryce would complete 200 hours of community service at the county's Deaf Education Center, learning sign language and assisting with children who faced the challenges he'd mocked. The quarterback would issue a public apology acknowledging his actions and their impact, taking full responsibility without deflection or excuse. His college recruitment materials would include disclosure of this incident, ensuring future coaches understood exactly what character they were evaluating. The school would implement mandatory anti-bullying education, including disability awareness training for all students and staff. A scholarship fund in Ren's name would be established, funded by the Kepler family, supporting deaf students pursuing higher education throughout Ohio. And finally, Silvano said, his eyes locking onto Bryce with intensity that made the teenager sink lower in his chair, "You will face my personal oversight for the remainder of your high school career. I will know your grades, your behavior, every action you take, and any deviation from the standards we established today will result in all evidence going directly to prosecutors." Gerald started to protest that this arrangement exceeded reasonable bounds, but his attorney touched his arm in warning. They'd lost this confrontation before it began, outmaneuvered by someone who understood power better than people born into it. The story broke Sunday morning across Patricia's investigative blog, her carefully researched article dismantling the Kepler family's history of buying their son out of consequences. By noon, traditional media outlets had picked it up, phone calls flooding the school district's offices from parents demanding policy changes. Ristorante Bellinotte's owner called Silvano Monday afternoon, proposing a community initiative that surprised even the mafioso with its scope. The restaurant would become the first in Youngstown to hire deaf servers, partnering with the local community college to create training programs that extended beyond their establishment. Within 2 weeks, 3 other businesses had followed the model, recognizing both moral imperative and positive publicity that came from visible inclusion efforts. Youngstown's mayor, sensing political opportunity, announced a citywide accessibility audit that he'd ignored for years until circumstances made inaction more dangerous than action. Bryce appeared at the Deaf Education Center on a Tuesday morning, his Letterman jacket left at home, dressed in plain clothes that stripped away the identity he'd hidden behind. The director, a woman named Joan who'd spent 40 years advocating for deaf children, assigned him to work with 5-year-olds learning their first signs. The quarterback discovered quickly that small children had no interest in his football achievements, no awareness of his family name, no reason to treat him as anything except another adult tasked with helping them communicate. One girl named Penny corrected his signing with patient exasperation, her tiny hands moving slower so he could follow properly. By his 3rd week, Bryce began understanding that deafness wasn't disability requiring pity, but difference requiring accommodation, a distinction he'd never considered, when difference existed, only to make him feel superior. He learned about cochlear implants and the controversy surrounding them, about deaf culture's richness and complexity, about communication extending far beyond spoken words. Ren returned to school the following Monday, his mother's hand tight on his shoulder as they walked through doors that had witnessed his humiliation spread across social media. But something fundamental had shifted. Students who'd shared the video now deleted it, some approaching with signed apologies they'd learned through weekend crash courses. His teacher had rearranged the classroom to ensure Ren could see everyone's faces during discussions, no longer relying solely on an interpreter who sometimes lagged behind rapid conversation. Other students began learning basic signs, creating an environment where accommodation wasn't special treatment, but natural integration. The scholarship fund exceeded its initial goal within 48 hours, donations arriving from across Ohio and eventually nationwide, as the story resonated with parents who'd fought similar battles for their disabled children. By December, it held enough to fund 4 full college scholarships, with contributions still arriving weekly. Silvano maintained distance from public aspects of the transformation, his involvement known primarily to those directly affected. He'd return to his usual table at Ristorante Bellinotte twice weekly, conducting business that thrived on intimidation and strategic violence, but always pausing to watch the new deaf servers navigate their shifts with growing confidence. Alina had quit one of her 3 jobs, the scholarship fund unexpectedly including a provision for Ren's current educational needs that eased her impossible budget. She'd argued against accepting what felt like charity, but Silvano had convinced her that reparations earned through forcing accountability weren't gifts, but compensation long overdue. They'd begun meeting for coffee Thursday afternoons when her schedule allowed, conversations starting with Ren's progress but gradually expanding to cover everything from Youngstown's decline to the ethics of wielding power without democratic oversight. Silvano found himself explaining his business with honesty he rarely risked, while Alina challenged assumptions he'd held for years about power and protection. These meetings never occurred at Ristorante Bellanotte or other establishments where Silvano's reputation preceded him, instead happening at a modest cafe near Alina's apartment where they could sit unnoticed among students and retirees. The owner was a Polish immigrant who'd survived her own traumas and recognized kindred spirits regardless of their divergent paths toward survival. Ren sometimes joined them, practicing signs with Silvano that became increasingly complex as the mafioso's fluency improved through dedicated study. The boy had begun teaching his little sister, their apartment filling with visual conversations that created intimacy impossible through spoken words, constantly competing with television and traffic noise. The video that had started everything was gradually buried by algorithm changes and new viral content, its view count frozen at 300,000, but its impact extending far beyond digital metrics. Schools across Ohio began citing the Youngstown Protocol when developing anti-bullying policies that specifically addressed disabled students. Principal Dawson implemented changes that cost him support from school board members allied with wealthy families, but gained him respect from teachers who'd spent careers watching vulnerable students slip through administrative cracks. He scheduled his own retirement for the following year, having finally done something that justified his education degree beyond pushing papers and avoiding controversy. Gerald Kepler resigned from the school board under pressure from parents whose children weren't protected by family money and legal intimidation. His business suffered as contractors quietly chose competitors, the social cost of his son's actions proving more expensive than any legal judgment could have imposed. Joan from the Deaf Education Center reported that Bryce had completed his required hours, but continued showing up voluntarily, forming particular bond with a 7-year-old boy whose parents had abandoned him to state care. The quarterback had begun exploring special education as potential major, his college recruitment shifting from athletics to service-focused programs that valued character transformation over touchdown statistics. Christmas approached with the particular beauty of a Rust Belt city, dressed in lights that almost disguised its decay, storefronts decorated with optimism that persisted despite empty buildings and closed factories. Youngstown wore winter like a familiar coat, shabby but comfortable, its people accustomed to surviving through seasons that tested those who couldn't find warmth in community and stubborn resilience. Ren discovered a package on the apartment's front steps, Christmas Eve morning, his name written in precise calligraphy, across pristine wrapping that seemed imported from a wealthier world. Inside lay a custom skateboard designed by a deaf artist from California, the deck painted with hands-forming signs that spelled out words like courage, worthy, and heard. Alina found her own gift that evening, an envelope containing a letter from Youngstown Community College, accepting her into their nursing program with full scholarship coverage. She read it 3 times before believing the words were real, her dream of becoming more than a waitress suddenly possible because someone had decided her struggle deserved intervention. Silvano's card attached to the acceptance letter contained only a single line. Some debts are paid forward, not back. She understood he was referring to his sister, to promises made in hospital chapels, to the particular mathematics of redemption that required giving away power to achieve anything resembling justice. New Year's Eve found them at Ristorante Bellanotte, not as charity cases but as invited guests of the owner who'd transformed his establishment into symbol of inclusion rather than exclusion. Ren sat at the table where Silvano had first watched his humiliation, now surrounded by servers who communicated fluently in signs and smiles. The restaurant buzzed with conversation conducted in multiple languages, spoken Italian and English mixing with ASL as deaf and hearing patrons shared space designed to accommodate rather than segregate. A pianist played in the corner, his music accompanied by an interpreter translating melodies into visual poetry for those who experienced rhythm through vibration and sight rather than sound. Silvano arrived late, detained by business he didn't specify, and Alina didn't ask about. Understanding their connection existed in a space that didn't require full disclosure of how he spent hours away from her presence. He'd changed into a tuxedo that made him appear even more intimidating, except for the way his eyes softened when they found Alina across the crowded room. They didn't speak much during dinner, but hands occasionally brushed when reaching for water glasses or passing bread, each contact carrying weight of things not yet named, but definitely present. Ren watched them with the particular perception children develop when they rely on visual cues, his small smile suggesting he understood what the adults were still pretending to ignore. Midnight approached with countdown displayed on screens throughout the restaurant for patrons who couldn't hear the verbal announcement. Everyone stood, glasses raised, as numbers descended toward the new year carrying promises of fresh starts and continued transformations. When the clock struck 12, Silvano's hand found Alina's naturally, their fingers intertwining with the ease of puzzle pieces that had always belonged together, but only recently discovered their matching edges. He didn't kiss her, too public, too presumptuous, but his thumb traced circles on her palm that communicated intention clearer than words could have managed. Ren tugged Silvano's sleeve, his hands forming signs that asked if the mafioso would teach him about his business someday, not the criminal aspects but the principles of power and protection that guided his decisions. Silvano's response came carefully, acknowledging the request while explaining that real strength meant choosing different paths than those their protectors had walked. Outside, snow began falling in fat flakes that caught light from street lamps and transformed Federal Street into something almost magical, despite the closed storefronts and struggling economy visible beneath holiday decoration. The city's problems hadn't disappeared, wouldn't disappear, but they seemed slightly less insurmountable when faced by people determined to create change within their limited spheres of influence. Bryce Kepler appeared unexpectedly at the restaurant's entrance, hesitating at the threshold before entering with posture that showed genuine uncertainty rather than entitled confidence. He'd come to deliver his final community service report to Joan, but seeing Ren there made him pause, calculating whether to approach or retreat. Ren made the decision for him, standing and crossing the distance with his skateboard tucked under one arm. His hands moved in signs Bryce now understood, offering something that looked remarkably like forgiveness mixed with challenge. Acknowledge what happened but prove through consistent action that you've genuinely changed. The quarterback's response came in careful signs still rough around edges, but comprehensible. Accepting responsibility while thanking Ren for helping him understand perspective he'd never considered when cruelty felt consequence-free. It wasn't friendship forming between them, but perhaps something more valuable, mutual recognition of shared humanity despite different experiences and circumstances. Silvano watched this exchange from his table, understanding that his involvement was complete, that the transformation he'd initiated now belonged to those most affected. Ren would face future challenges, Bryce would experience setbacks in his character development, but they'd both been given tools and examples, showing paths toward justice that didn't require violence or revenge. Alina leaned against Silvano's shoulder, the gesture casual but profound in its demonstration of trust, earned through consistent action rather than empty promises. They sat in comfortable silence while conversations swirled around them, their connection existing in the spaces between words where understanding developed through shared values and complementary scars. The night ended with Silvano driving Alina and her children home through snow-covered streets that transformed Youngstown into something almost beautiful. He walked them to their door, and before leaving, he signed goodnight to Ren with fluency that had required dedication. Most people wouldn't invest in learning someone else's language. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support matters and helps me continue bringing you these powerful stories of justice, redemption, and the courage it takes to stand up for those who can't always stand up for themselves.